La vida es corta sin parar, mirar y de reír para celebrar. Cada momento hay que gozar, como si mañana no va a llegar.
Hola, hola. Welcome to Entre Tías Amiguis, the podcast where we dive into the wild roller coaster ride of adulting. I'm your host, Adri Rodriguez, a queer Salvadorian native, a first-gen trailblazer, a multipreneur and licensed psychotherapist, here to share wisdom, stories, and real talk with my tías and amiguis and other incredible guests who inspire and uplift our community. I want to remind you that while I am a licensed psychotherapist, this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The discussions we have here are not substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Now let's dive into today's conversation and explore the journey of adulting together. Grab your cafecito, get comfy, and let's get started. Hi, Tokaya. Nice to have you here in my podcast. I'm so honored that you accepted the invitation because I have so many questions and many things that I want to ask you. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm the host of Entre Tías y Amiguis, conversations about everything adulting. And the inspiration of this podcast came for me around like this idea of sitting in la sala or en la cocina, you know, when you're cooking and then you just start going from like listening to una canción, crying together with like a tia, like a prima, like a bestie, because like all of a sudden you got like super deep and serious and you're getting like amor, but también advice and all of that. And so I know a lot of really cool people, you being one of them. And I just wanted to bring, you know, these conversations for others to be able to hear as something special about the two of us is that we both are therapists. And though we're not going to be like doing like a clinical interview, right? And like getting to know you because I'm more interested in knowing like, who's Adriana? Like, what are some of those experiences that she's been through that I'm curious about? Inevitably, clinicians or clinical lens, you know, might come up. And so I'm really excited to have you here. And to begin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sakaya, for inviting me. This is so beautiful. And you know, I love your setup. I think the entire, for sure, California mental health, Latina mental health colleagues have been super excited about your podcast. So that's really beautiful and intentional. And I'm looking forward not only to this interview, but to future ones with our colleagues. Pero en eso, my name is Adriana. I'm the founder of Latinx Therapy. Most folks may recognize that. I am now an EMDR approved consultant, currently working on my own curriculum so that I can be an EMDR trainer. I think that's been the biggest identity right now besides my role as a mother, because it's really like writing a book. It takes a long time to create a curriculum for like 6-7 days. And so, yeah, it's just taken up a lot, but I'm really excited for that. And I'm Guatemalan Mexican, first gen. Ya no tengo mis papás. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I think overall, though, I also want to share that I haven't had any connection to my Guatemalan roots. My mom was basically a child of she grew up as an only child, and she never, I think after maybe her brother was like 10 or 11, he left. Y so I really only know the Mexican side of my family, who I'm very connected with. And so, yeah, overall, these days I stay really busy with Latinx therapy projects and running my group practice, and also dabbling a little bit in my nonprofit.
Busy bee and a jack of all trades and serve every single one of them, which is my favorite. I think like some of my favorite people are like equally as busy as I am, but also dabble in like a bunch of stuff. And just even hearing your intro, I'm like, I have this question and this question and this question. And so we'll find a little bit of space for all of them. I know that I first came across you on your podcast, Latinx Therapy, way back like 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember listening, like it was forever ago, and started listening and became like an avid follower of your work. And so to be here as colleagues, like y amigas también, because it's like that we've crossed that threshold is so exciting. And so you also mentioned that you love board games, and I did want to, as an intro, as a little like a fun fact, like loteria, and you said sequence, I think. You have it right there.
We've been playing it all week. It's because it's new to the home, so lo tengo que estrenar.
I love that. I love that. Well, let's get started with talking a little bit about, keeping the inner child alive makes me think about the topic that we sort of chose, which is parentification, right? And so very commonly for many daughters, I'm the eldest daughter in my family, other daughters and families, that there's this role of just like you suddenly become this mini adult that is like an extension of your parents or extension of the other adults in your family. And so why don't we talk a little bit about that parentification? How do you define it? What has been your experience? How has parentification manifested in your life? I would love to hear about that.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and begin with defining it. Parentification is when a child is given responsibilities that are not developmentally appropriate for them. So developmentally can be physically, can be emotionally, psychologically, and even spiritually, medically. And so it's is when they're given duties, tasks that are not appropriate for them. That's the simplest way that I can explain. And I want to also share that not all parentification experiences lead to trauma. I have spoken with many different people that have been parentified, and their experiences are not traumatic for them. And for many others, parentification experiences have been traumatic. So it's really much a case-by-case, lived experience by experience basis.
What do you think is a determinant factor, or like what kind of leads some of these experiences into a more traumatic perspective versus like these are things that were happening in my family, my home? I know that even some parentified adult children find like pride, right? Like I know there are parts of my own parentified experience that bring a lot of pride of just like the child that I was and like how much help I gave. But then there's also kind of like that point stop of like, well, this kind of feels like actually was pretty traumatic for me and my experiences. So what have you seen in terms of making that determination of a parentified experience being traumatic versus not traumatic or somewhere in the spectrum?
It's really going to depend on the dynamics and I think the healthiness of the parents, the affection that they give to their children as well, the children that have been parentified, because what I have found as a trauma therapist too is that for adults that were parentified in their childhood chronically, most of that feelings there weren't, I'm sorry, for most of their lives, their feelings were not taken into consideration, were not validated. And so when feelings are ignored and obligations are mandated, if you will, then they are likely to experience more trauma within those experiences. But I think that for those that experience gratefulness, right? Muchas gracias, te aprecio, an explanation as to why this is happening, but in a gentle way, with even sometimes the option of opting out. Some of those cases are less likely to be traumatizing, but nonetheless, everybody can take these experiences differently because even though an experience of parentification may lead to trauma, that person can still cause harm in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe invalidating an experience they had with another relative, maybe talking to them about their weight or about their choices in a certain thing. And so, you know, the mere association of the person can make it a traumatizing overall childhood.
It makes me think this idea, porque a veces hay necesidad, no? There is like this way that like immigrant children sometimes de la necesidad de estar de un mundo al otro, de estar aprendiendo a vivir aquí, allá, right? Like kind of this culture brokerage that happens that you're like between back and forth. But I really like what you said about like the option of opting out and to being able to also receive gratitude versus like these are things that are expected of you and like the weight of being a kid with this huge expectations. How did parentification show up for you and like your family dynamics? What is your experience personally with this concept of being parentified?
So for us, I grew up with my one older sister and three younger siblings and my two parents. And we were very much a low socioeconomic family and interdependence was really important. Like we all had different duties for the home, not just cleanliness wise, but I think like emotional and physical wise, just administrative wise. And so with us, my oldest sister definitely took the role of taking care of all of the children, myself and my two younger siblings. I didn't experience that. And she's 6 years older than me, and my parents worked graveyard shift delivering newspapers. And in the morning, they would go they would buy like wholesale baby clothes and go door to door and sell them at apartments. And so my sister was responsible for taking us to school. We ate at school, our breakfast and our lunch. The meal we would have at home would be dinner. And so, she was there for us when we had chicken pox. All of us got them at the same time. My little sister was 6 months at the time. And so that physical burden really, really went all on my older sister, Jasmine. And for myself, as I grew up, I had some of like the chore responsibility, but more than anything, I was responsible for my brother's academics. So back then, we would be given summer packets of a bunch of homework, and it was a thick packet for most teachers. And he had an undiagnosed learning disability. He had a really hard time with school. And I didn't have a hard time by any means, because I think for me, with growing up with the chaos of my parents not being home and my older sister taking care of us, and just growing up in the 90s and how hard it was for immigrant families, I thrived in academics because that was the only area where I had control. Many of us parentified children with strict parents, I think, thrived in academia. And so I was president of my elementary school. I was the teacher's pet. I really, really, just focused all my energy in school, which is what I felt I could do. Our parents didn't have time for us emotionally. My father did, but my mom didn't allow. It seemed like she would get jealous and she wouldn't really let us have any emotional contact with our dad, even though we lived with him, which was strange. Yeah, I was responsible for my brother. Well, my little sister, I barely remember her because she was an infant and I didn't have any responsibilities with her. But as I got older, entering college for sure, I'm the only one in my family that got a degree, that got a bachelor's and a master's. And so I have never worked a full-time job, but I've worked various part-time jobs as an entrepreneur. So I started that really young because I witnessed, the struggles financially of my parents. I never had the newest stuff. I would actually borrow clothes from my friends so that I could kind of in trend. Yeah. And so it was difficult, but my dad, he would always work harder so that he wouldn't have to say no to me. Pues all of that is something that motivated me, to give back to my family. And so when I was I guess it was in college, because that's when I got pregnant, I started lifeguarding and doing swim instruction and giving back to my family financially so that it wouldn't be, the mortgage wouldn't be as much of a burden for them. And since then, up until my mom's passing, I was responsible financially for the mortgage and expenses for my mom.
So even though you had so each of the siblings had a different type of responsibility. And so the experience of parentification, we could say, oh, this is like the umbrella, the definition, but you're giving the example of exactly how it showed up for each of you a little bit differently. It makes me think about my own experience with parentification. So I grew up in El Salvador, and I was 6 and my little sister was 2 when our parents left and they immigrated to the States, and they made the choice of not bringing us with us out of the fear of what happens if we're undocumented. And so we had a 9-year long separation, and we had my paternal grandma that took care of us and was the adult responsible for us. So I didn't have necessarily to change my sister's diapers or feed her the basic needs. But there was an expectation of academic and spiritual sort of shepherding of eres la mayor, tienes que cuidar a tu hermana, tienes que portarte bien, eres el ejemplo, right? She's looking at you, she's watching your steps. And so the role of parentification wasn't this direct, I'm responsible solely for this little kiddo, but there was a lot of expectations of what kind of kid I should be. And so it sounds like that's a very common unspoken thing that gets put onto us that have experienced parentification, that it's not like they're telling you this is your task list, right? But there is an expectation, you got to help your brother. And now imagining you being a little kid helping your brother who has a learning disability that hasn't been discovered yet, what an ask of a child to be taking care of somebody that needed even more supports than just an average student, right?
Yeah. And what you're saying also reminds me that I'm missing out on complete chunks. But growing up, my mom always used each of us as her own therapist, if you will. And there was a lot of trauma that my mom experienced in Guatemala and why she fled. So all of those memories, from parentification involve emotional divulgence to me since as young as I can remember, like 5 years old. I can remember in the car just hearing horrible things and of my mom's experience, complaints about different aspects of her life as well. And at some point as I got older, I didn't regret it, but what's the word? Like I resented it, especially because I would be in the car and there's no out. I can't turn around. I can't leave. I can't walk away. I had to listen. And so I feel, from going to therapy, I've learned that I developed dissociation from those experiences. And I became really good at that.
Your brain pulled you out. You can't leave, so my brain is gonna go somewhere else.
That's it. Yeah. And again, like she started as young as I can remember, 5 years old, and it didn't stop. Maybe when I started setting boundaries, which was like 4 years before her death. And it was a really long time. And I know she did that to my older sister. She tried doing it to my brother, but he was always very much, oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. Like he was really good at just taking the conversation elsewhere. I don't know if it was his own ADHD or what that was. But yeah, in regards to my experience, we were all like emotional caretakers for my mom. When she'd cry, she would tell us like, oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But we'd be so concerned. We'd be like, well, we know we're a family in need. Like, is there something wrong? Are we not making enough money? Are we going to have to leave this home? Are you losing your job? What's going on? So we'd always think of worst case scenarios in our minds. And that's when my mom just wouldn't tell us what's going on. So I think all of those experiences are connected to parentification too. You're in survival mode for your family chronically, and you want to rescue them. And so you also, when it comes to parentification, you don't have to be asked about it. You could take it upon yourself because of the family's need as well. Like I translated for my father's job. He had a supervisor role in the newspaper company that he was at, and his bosses only spoke English. So I had to write all the emails in English. And I learned how to write like, ¿cómo lo digo? Like a white man, if you will, like just very stern. I'm just very to the point when it comes to texts and emails, especially when it's connected to work. And so that's how that kind of translation impacted me today.
Being privy of things are beyond your understanding, your capacity to understand as kids, then it makes you feel like you're responsible for it. You're trying to save people. You're trying to avoid even giving more trouble. Yeah, it's a huge emotional load. Definitely that happens. How do you think the cultural values of Latinx culture also have to do with parentification? Because I can think, for example, of like as a woman, right? Marianismo, right? Like being like the expectation that you're meek, quiet, you're of service, you're always helping your family. Boom, like that going directly into parentification. It's like almost like the perfect value to make you feel like you're doing like the job that you're being, that all these good things are coming out of this experience of parentification, but at the same time, right, like the load that it takes. What are your thoughts about how the cultural values show up alongside parentification?
I think you're spot on. One of the ways that Marianismo is connected to many of our families is with the eldest daughter and giving her the most responsibilities because they're trying to prep her to be the best wife, the best mother. Even though that's not in that 11-year-old, 8-year-old's mind at all, but it's I think that cultural notion that's been embedded from Marianismo and also machismo, which is expecting of women to serve, the men and to have the food available. And in that regard, my brother, I don't know if he really experienced parentification. We haven't really talked about this topic particularly, but I do remember that, my family would be like, es que es varón, like he's a boy. It's fine. Let him just leave his dish at the table. We'd have to pick it up for him. It never made sense to me. And I will also say that I personally didn't grow up with many machista values from my dad, if at all. But the machista values came from my mother.
Mm-hmm.
That was her way, I think, from all the trauma she experienced from men of taking control with people that she could control. And so I have always found that to be very fascinating because I always assumed that all those notions could come just from men. And that is not necessarily the case. The patterns could play out in different ways. But in regards to like the general community, so marianismo, machismo are definitely common values. And then the sense of familismo, right? I think in English it's familism. And so with that, it's that the family should be united and work for one another, prioritize one another. And I find that that comes out to be harmful as well when one family member wants to reach out for help, when they don't trust their family, when there's no emotional safety, perhaps because of parentification and all other toxic cultural notions going on in the household, or normalization of toxic dysfunctional patterns. And so I think feminismo can be harmful in that sense when there's no when they don't allow the spectrum of other folks to be involved in helping you. And that's definitely really sad and furthers the stigma.
I think feminism also makes me think about this value of like family first, right? Like I think about all the ways when grad season is, like I see all these graduates with their beautiful caps, right? And it's like para mi familia, right? And there is like, I always have like this conflict between like, but like, this was for you, like you did this really, really hard work. And then immediately in our families, right? Like it is this expectation that everything that you do, you're like this representative of the family, and the family comes first. And so when we're asking something of you, it is for the benefit of everybody in the heart, right? Like that sentiment feels really good. It's like everything that we do it as a community, we do it with that collective care. And then there's an impact of not being able to get your needs met and ask for the things that you need as an individual, because your individual needs are always being contrasted or valued upon what everybody else needs. And many times in our families, there isn't enough for everybody, right? And so as parentified children sort of get in this position of getting used to getting our needs met, or not even asking for it, or even realizing that we have specific needs that are different than everybody else in our family.
I've seen that with food too. It's like there's one last meal left and you'd rather stay hungry so that maybe your younger sibling or your working parents can have that food. And so it's definitely a self-sacrificial notion and value that we take upon, because that's one way we are trying to show gratefulness for our family as well. But in reality, it's leading to a pattern that is ultimately going to harm ourselves later, and finding balance would be best. And that's so confusing for someone that just turns 18, right? Or someone that is 15, 16. How do you find balance? And we're keeping it pretty light, Tocaya, right? Where we're not even keeping, or we're not really focusing on the families that are really toxic and have I would say I also had severe intergenerational trauma for sure. I also know that there's worse. And there's clients that we've had out there that have shared how their families will always compare their logros, their accomplishments, with someone else's. Like, oh, you're not doing enough, or oh, you could do this better. And so how is someone going to want to share, and take care of themselves if they keep getting compared to someone else or are being called lazy? And that's the other unfortunate side of all of this, including parentification.
No, I totally agree. I mean, because there is also the part of like very common in our culture, right? Is that this ongoing judgment of just like comparing people, and very many times either you're being the person compared to, mira cómo estudia, mira la hija de ellos, right? And then on the other side is just like, you're not good enough, you're not doing all of these things. And so it's like even the children being played against each other within a family. There's so many ways that this definitely shows up, and that it could be, like you said earlier, for some people extremely traumatic, and for other people may not, right? And it has to do also with just the general family dynamics and like the health of the family system overall, that also will impact how this parentification impacted you. How have you seen the parentification show up through the years with your siblings, with your parents, at the loss of your mom? Like, how did parentification has shown up at different stages, right? Because we're focusing on a little bit of the early years of giving too much responsibility. But unless you know you've been parentified, or unless you do some work around deparentifying yourself or understanding how it shows up, right? Like likely you still might be living with this role of a parentified child even in adulthood. How have you seen your relationships with your family members be impacted, positive or negative, or areas of growth because of your role as a parentified child in your family?
Well, one example that comes to mind, it's just like ringing, and it's not directed to me right now, but this example is with my older sister. I think when she got married, my mom held this expectation that her husband should now be helping my mom at all times. Like whenever my mom needed help, that he would be available for her as well. And so I feel like that was a sense of she was trying to parentify him in a way, right? By triangulating him into, I don't know, the responsibilities. So years later, when he set boundaries, she didn't like that. Well, my mom didn't like boundaries at all. And she was a violent parent with us. And so, you know, she wasn't violent with him, but she was verbally aggressive. Well, from there, her relationship changed with him because she was like, I don't know what exactly she said about him. I can't remember right now, but I would assume like something like, oh, he's lazy or he's ungrateful or like, things like that. So that's definitely one way. And it created a natural rift between her and my sister because my sister also wanted to set some boundaries. They had 3 kids at that time too, and running their own household and taking care of my mom, living far, a little bit far, just wasn't realistic. And they're also a low SES family, and so they have to work and they work multiple jobs. Y pues, yeah, that separation, creating separation from the responsibilities and obligations, she suffered a lot with that emotionally and physically. And then for myself, I think I grew very fearful of my mother over the years as I got older. And I thought as a kid, I would become stronger and I wouldn't fear my mother, that I would be able to tell her whatever was on my mind and that I just wouldn't care. But the opposite happened, whereas when I got back from UC Santa Barbara to live with my family, I was a parent, right? My son was 3 years old, 2 years old at the time, because I graduated 2012. Well, at that point, she was also controlling my life because she didn't see me as an adequate parent. And so I couldn't really develop myself comfortably as a young mom either. There was just that heightened anxiety that I think just divulged, that just came about from my entire childhood. I had a place to place it onto. ¿Cómo lo digo? Like I had a place to direct that anxiety, and that was school. But once I graduated and I was just living at home with her and my son, it had nowhere to go. And so it manifested in just heightened fear, heightened anxiety, and keeping to myself, isolating, not really talking to her either. So there was that definite resentment that was showing up a little bit more. I would still do what she needed. I would still listen to her whenever she'd talk to me about her traumas, but I think I was trying to also give her some guidance. My role definitely evolved into one where I was trying to be a mentor. And then when I ended my graduate program, which was in 2013, and I got some experience, right? I got licensed in 2017. I became more of like a parent towards her, where I accepted that. And I felt like that was going to be a lot easier for me than pushing back against her. And during the pandemic, that's something that she then resented from me. And she would be like, oh, es que te crees la mamá de la casa, But during the pandemic,
Which one is it? Am I or am I not, right?
Yeah, because during the pandemic, she became very violent, where my little sister had to move out. She wasn't safe and she didn't feel safe. I didn't either, but I was in the process of saving and I was so close so that I could be able to afford my own place. And my brother at that point was just staying in his room, like not coming out, like just trying to avoid her at all costs because her hours got reduced. Not that this is a justification, but she was very much like an angry young teenager that had no coping skills and had all the power in the house. it was her house. We respected that and we knew that. Yeah, it was just a very like daunting time. And so I felt the need to kind of take some control in the sense of like, I told my brother, just don't come out. If she talks to you, just give her a call instead of facing her directly. I was just trying to guide him as to how to keep the tension as minimal as possible. And for me as well, I think at some point I had to end up actually blocking her because she was the one that would be like calling excessively or entering my home without knocking. And I remember in some meetings she would do that. And then she would get embarrassed because she realized I was working from my kitchen. That's where in 2020, I had a lease in Burbank, my first one, because of all that. And so that's a long story, but overall, it evolved into that of me being more parent-like.
Well, what's interesting about, as you share your story, is like you came back from college, you finished your master's, you're a business owner, you're providing for yourself, and this dynamic that got so cemented so early on, right, in this relationship, even as an adult, that things that has controlled our life, if we're not aware of it, if we're like not healing from it, we are just in the same, like in el mismo vortex, like just repeating it over and over. And because I could think about this maybe like ideas like one day for me to do it. And so this parentification role is so confusing because it's like, it gets developed from a place of wanting to please, wanting to care, wanting to give to our families. And how do we know when it's too much? What is that line that has crossed that is just like, I cannot just continue to give you my everything. Like at some point, I also have to be able to set out some boundaries to take care of myself. But that likely in many families will not go well. Like I know my family setting those boundaries hasn't gone well, because I'm estranged from my family out of the fact that I've decided to live a life that they don't agree with, right? And so there is this punitive nature to wanting to get out of these roles that many people experience.
Yeah, and I think for those that end up, como lo digo, like for people that end up wanting to continue a relationship with their parents that may be toxic, I really feel like even in adulthood, parentification will break when you start setting consistent boundaries, when you just speak that voice, because that's definitely what happened with me, at least, when even though I was an adult, 19, 20, 21, 22, living at home, it wasn't until I was firm and consistent with my boundaries that I finally felt like an adult. Like I finally took charge of, well, I was always responsible for my son, but I took charge of the parenting choices going around with my son and trying to navigate the tension in the home. Like that was at that point my choice. Like I wasn't being parentified at that point. And when my mom had her medical issues, those were all my choices. They weren't obligations. I actually had to convince her to let me help her. And from the boundaries that I had set, she was like, no, it's because you have your life. You don't want to help me. I'll find a way. I'll find a right. Right. It was that guilt tripping. And so I had to push those aside and say, no, like you're going to listen to me. I live with you. I'm available and wanting to help you. I don't hate you. So sometimes our parents tend to equate boundaries with hate. And that's very sad. And for at least my mother, it came from a wounded inner child that didn't have these healthy experiences where somebody could set a healthy boundary. I don't think in her childhood she ever had someone set a healthy boundary. I also believe that they were very abusive with her.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing, right? Like that all this intergenerational trauma that really is at the root of this family dynamics that we're talking about. It's nobody's fault. I try to have the utmost compassion for both my parents and try to understand that they don't have the skills, the tools to sort of behave and act different relationship with me. And right, it is so painful because here we are like trying to like mend and trying to do better and trying to do it differently. And we're battling not only like the present current family dynamic, but also intergenerational patterns that are really, really old and can be really hard to break if we don't have two parties that are wanting to engage with each other in new ways, right? It's just like just keep reenacting them.
Yeah.
I know that you like sprinkle here and there about the loss of your mother. And so since your mother's passing, what has been sort of your now journey, this role of parentification, because you still have your siblings. I know you also have half siblings, right? And so this role of being a parentified child in some ways, like how has it transformed, changed, continue to be an area of healing for you as now, especially after the passing of your mom?
For myself, I think that it's been a point of awareness where I want to make sure that I don't do that as a parent to my son. My son is 14 years old, and so that's been a task of mine that I've taken on over the years. Like, I always think, what are developmentally appropriate things for him? And I remember it was so interesting because when she was alive, her role was that of a grandmother, right? This is when I was living now in the front house. I wasn't, in a room on her side of the home, but in the front house, we still had to go through her house. We would knock because the máquinas to wash our clothes were in her backyard. And so I think the door was open between both houses, and she saw that my son was separating his clothes. He must have been 7 or 8 at the time. And I felt like that was a very appropriate task, like for him to just separate colors from whites. I was going to go take it to the máquina. And she started crying, bawling. She was just like, eres muy mala. ¿Cómo puedes hacerle eso? I was so confused at first. And then I was like, oh, she's serious. And I was like, esto no es malo que él aprenda cómo separar la ropa. And she was crying, calling me mala, sangrona. And at that point, I had learned, how to emotionally distance myself from her words. And of course, my son started crying because he didn't want to do that. And it was just like, a little like, okay, I had to control the moment. Let's close the door. Let's close the energy there. Pero that's also something so interesting that I saw in myself in my family dynamics. And I see in clients where the mothers that have been so abusive and hella parentified end up being very soft grandmothers, like very considerate grandmothers. No sé cómo decirlo, pero sí les duele todo, and they're very protective of the grandchildren, which I think is beautiful. But I think there's that disconnection when it comes to developmental responsibilities. And maybe it comes from the subconscious, from like them feeling guilty because of everything that they enforced. Pero bueno, back to your question, that's been a huge mission of mine to teach my son responsibilities, especially as a boy. He's not growing up in a machista, marianismo type of household. I want him to learn how to be a good citizen, to learn how to be a good roommate, if you will, share responsibilities in the home. And so for me, that's kind of been my major task. And when my mom passed away, like I think at that point, we also didn't have many parentified roles at that point. It all became like caregiver roles. When I couldn't take her to the hospital, I would ask in my sibling chat who would be available to take her. And sometimes, everybody was very willing and able. So it was a very peaceful time in that sense. It was stressful in the sense that we didn't know about my mom's health, and las recaídas are very stressful as it is, her overall that. Pero yeah, I don't know how to answer that completely because I'm still also processing the loss. But I will say that I did an interview maybe a year after with Locatora Radio, and I didn't realize until after the fact how dissociated I was during that interview and those questions. And as of January of this year, I don't feel like that anymore. I don't feel that numbness connected to me talking about my mom. Everything feels so different when it comes to grief. And it's been so wonderful inside to feel that way, to feel like I'm learning about myself. Because when you're parentified chronically for as long as, let's say I was, for as long as many of us have been, you don't know yourself. Your whole world revolves around that parent that parentified you. So I've been able to refine myself, to define my new identities, because now it's not about, oh, what does my mom need? Bought a home 6 minutes away so that I could be so close to her. And this was after her diagnosis. Everything happened in 1 week where I was, when you buy a house, I closed on the home. Yeah, we the same week that she was diagnosed. And well, everything closed like the same week. And I was like, I regret this so much. My parentification came out in that moment because I was like, I could have dealt with her anger longer. I definitely had more capacity. I should have just not bought a house. Now I won't be able to be there for her at nights. Now maybe I'll have to see if Jaden, my son, can come sleep at her house, or I leave him at the new house with my husband. I don't know. I was just trying to brainstorm, like, how can I change my life so that I somehow go back and help my mom? And then I always have to ground myself. No, I have a son. Like, he has to be my priority. My mom cannot be my priority anymore. And so it's those reminders that I had to go back and forth on a lot.
And it's making me think about the concept of individuation, right? Which is like it can be really hard when you come from collectivistic environments to be able to individuate and become your own person. And even like what you mentioned earlier, like my sibling chat, right? Like I was asking, who can do this? Who can take this over? I can hear in the little bit of a part of your story about like that the individuation happening little by little, where you reprioritize things and reorganize them in a way that actually met you where you were at with your values, still honoring, respecting, and loving your mother, but also keeping in mind that there are other parts of you that also deserve the space to exist and to allow you to just be yourself, right? And that's where really healthy boundaries come from. That it's not about boundaries, it's just about saying no to people all the time, but it's just like, how do I say no to you while I myself, while also keeping a conscientious mind that I may want to still be of service to my family. I still love them and I still want to be there, but it's not at the cost of myself and the things that I need and my family, my immediate family, for you, your son and your husband, to make sure that they're being taken care of as well, right? Like it's not a either or, it's like a both and, but in an order that makes the most sense to you.
Yeah. And for me, that was really like buying this home to create that separation in order to just make the boundaries also a little bit more easier. I mean, by that time in the last year, she wasn't walking comfortably. And the really interesting thing too is that I found myself less afraid of her, because remember, she's like a very physical person. So I found myself less afraid of her as she got sick, because, she was just very just hurting. And so I knew like, oh, no harm is going to happen. And so, yeah, that's definitely been one point, in therapy that was very conflicting, because it's like, I don't want to feel this way, but I do feel this way. Like my inner child finally feels safe.
Right.
Safe for all of us, not just me, for my brother that was still living on her side, And so, yeah, parentification, when there's trauma involved, there's so many different layers connected, because the experiences just expand beyond obligations and duties.
So as we wrap up from this interview, and I think it's going to be the first of many, like I have so many other questions, another bunch of topics that we can keep talking about. This is the coolest thing. It's like I can interview you again. I don't have to get everything done today. So from like a clinician lens, what do you want to say to some of the listeners, right? Aquí estamos entre tías y amiguis tratando de tener conversaciones like that happen in private. And I'm very thankful of my guests of wanting to be vulnerable and be able to share this, because I know that people out there will relate to your story, to the little sprinkles that I also shared about my story. But from a clinical lens, where do we begin with doing this work? Like, how do folks that are listening to this interview say, oh, shoot, like I may have some of that going on in my family? Like, what recommendations do you have? Because you are a trained psychotherapist, you're an EMDR trainer very soon to be. And so how have you navigated this experience personally in your own healing that may be kind of like a recommendation for others as they begin to explore how parentification has shown up for them?
With this topic, I'm going to have to keep both roles together. This is something that I would share as a therapist, and something that has been helpful from my therapist as well. And so that would be that when it comes to those parents and caregivers that have been parentified and maybe have already parentified their own children, it's not too late to help, to change. I think awareness is really important. So learning more about the topic, especially if this episode is resonating with you, or if the definition of parentification resonates, learning what are different developmentally appropriate chores and conversations for children. I think there's also conversations that we tend to avoid because we're not trying to parentify, and that's another avenue that can be risky, if you will. And so getting more educated on this topic is very healing for the entire family. This helps to break intergenerational traumas and cycles. So education truly is key when it comes to this. And I can't emphasize that enough. And then when it comes to other aspects of healing, grief, you've heard it time and time, it isn't linear. It looks so different for everybody. I've had to be very forgiving of myself for just taking as long as I have. And even then, I think just be very accepting of those that are grieving, whether you are a boss of someone that is grieving, whether you're a friend or a relative, everyone is going to respond differently to their grief. And so I think being aware of that as well, just not having a certain timeline for someone to get over it is important. And if you are grieving, if you have this experience, like this toxic experience with any parent really, or your siblings even, find spaces where you can share your story, find support groups, or if you can, individual therapy. But I really find that when we are in community of people that have shared lived experiences, it goes so beyond healing because you don't feel as alone. And that's something that a lot of people have shared with me when I share on Instagram. They send me DMs and they're like, oh, wow, I didn't know, that's what that was called. I have that experience and I want to heal from it. I don't want to repeat that. You sharing your story has been so helpful for my grief journey. And these are people I didn't know that it would be helpful, for them. And it's so beautiful. So if we can come together and share these stories, I think that we would echo healing.
Community. And that's one of your passions and something that you do really beautifully. And so I know that it's not just like something that you're saying, but it's like a value of yours to bring us all together to share the experiences, whether professional experiences to personal experiences in which we can be seen, we can be validated, we can say me too, that happened to me too, even if it happened a little bit different, and having the opportunity to what is it that happened in those childhood experiences that we were too young to really understand and put name. And now that here we are as adults, we come together and we push through, right? The only way through is through. Really with this is like about learning new ways of being and showing up for every instance where our parentified small inner child wants to be the one in charge, and it's like no, time out. What does adult me, what does healthy me, what does me with this understanding want to do to live with intention and with still honoring our families, because it's complicated out here.
Yeah, even though they may not agree with your choices, they are your choices for a reason. And even if they're wrong choices, you have to learn on your own from your wrong choices. And that's another point that I've taken into all of this. Like, oh yeah, my parents are right about that. Oh well, here I am learning now about it. Thank you so much.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. I will have on the show notes all the ways to get in touch with Adriana. And so but this is like one of the interviews, is like with little introduction. We already know who you are. We love you so much. We appreciate all the work that you do. Thank you so much for coming in to Tias y Amiguis today. And so I hope that this sparks some conversation for you all as listeners. And we'll have a part 2 and other topics coming soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Adriana, and to the community.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with your tias and amiguis. Your support helps us reach more people and continue these important conversations. And don't forget to follow us on social media and stay connected. Until next time, remember to take care of yourself, embrace your journey, and keep living life with heart, vision, and creativity.